Hey guys, and welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today I've got a video for you on a gaming laptop that you guys actually might consider buying this time. It is the Asus ROG Strix GL502VS. This is a 15.6 inch gaming laptop powered by the NVIDIA GeForce GTX 1070. So it comes on the upper end of the performance and price scale, but it's certainly very well suited to 1080p gaming at above 60 frames per second. Before I dive into the design, I will just talk briefly about the hardware in my review unit here. This is an Intel Core i7-7700HQ processor with 16GB of DDR4 RAM. There's also a 256GB SSD paired with a 1TB hard drive, and of course there's the GTX 1070 in there for some GPU power. This is the only configuration available to you in Australia. If you're in the United States, again, there's just one configuration, but the 256GB SSD is swapped out for a 128GB SSD instead. As this is a 15.6 inch laptop, it's reasonably portable as far as GTX 1070 gaming laptops are concerned. It's 30mm thick, so that's around the same thickness as competitors from MSI and Gigabyte and even Alienware, but it's actually quite a lot lighter at just 2.2 kilograms when most other laptops of this class are pushing up to the 3kg mark. So you definitely get a more portable experience than you'll find from some of the other options available, and of course it's not a 17 inch laptop, so you might be able to actually fit it into your backpack. But don't forget that if you are taking around this laptop, you will have to carry the 200+ watt power brick, which clocks in at 650 grams, so that adds to the heft of this unit a little bit, but you'll find that on all gaming laptops with such powerful hardware inside. Asus has used a primarily plastic construction for the GL502VS to keep its weight down, but this leads to a look and feel that is just a little bit cheap, especially compared to its competitors that use a lot more metal around the body. There is some metal to be found on this laptop. The lid is quite a nice brushed black design, but Asus has tried to imitate this with the plastic used around the keyboard, and it doesn't quite hit the mark here, at least in my opinion. I quite like the use of a black base color with some vibrant orange highlights. It is pushing into the gamer style territory, especially when you factor in those odd patterns that Asus has used here in some of the awkward angles, but compared to the silver model that is available for the GL502VS, I definitely prefer this black and orange design. It's reasonably good as far as gaming laptops are concerned. What I wasn't as impressed with is the keyboard, which has a surprisingly shallow travel distance in a laptop that's 30mm thick. A lot of other gaming laptops tend to push the boundaries as far as travel distance is concerned, and that gives you a better tactile experience while gaming, but the GL502VS has pretty much an ultrabook keyboard, and I don't think that gives the best experience in gaming. It also has a reasonably cramped arrow keys that they've shoved in between the right modifiers and the numpad. The inclusion of a numpad is quite handy on a 15.6 inch laptop, but I wish they would have pushed some of the travel distance up a little bit so that it gave you a better feel in games. The trackpad, it's not too bad. It has a decent tracking experience and a reasonable click to it. I don't expect anyone will be using it for gaming, but it's nice to know that it works effectively for the times that you're not using this laptop with an external mouse. The I/O on the GL502VS is pretty standard. On the left hand side you'll find mini DisplayPort, HDMI, Ethernet, USB 3.0 and a USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C port. On the right hand side there's an SD card slot, 2 further USB 3.0 ports and a single 3.5mm audio jack. I probably would have liked to see Thunderbolt 3 here as well as an additional 3.5mm audio jack, but I think the range of USB ports and display outputs will satisfy most gamers here. I'm pretty happy with the display that Asus has opted for here. It's a 15.6 inch TN LCD with a resolution of 1920 by 1080. Because it's TN, you can't expect fantastic color performance or viewing angles, and that's certainly the case with this particular laptop. It doesn't quite hit the marks in terms of our color performance tests, but the key feature here is its 120Hz refresh rate and support for G-Sync. The GTX 1070 in this laptop can often push frame rates above the 60 FPS mark, so the fact that this laptop can run at 120Hz with some nice smooth adaptive sync means you'll be getting a really good gaming experience, even if it comes at the expense of slightly weaker color performance. You still get 330 nits of brightness and a contrast ratio of around 1200 to 1, but again, I wouldn't be using this laptop for color accurate work. And now it's time for the section that all you guys are interested in, the performance. And we'll start off by diving straight into our PC Mark workloads. Starting off with the home suite here. As you can see here, the ROG GL502VS performs quite well with its i7-7700HQ. And the sort of lead that you'll see over some GTX 1060 laptops is carried over into the creative workload, which is a bit more GPU bound than some of the other PC Mark workloads. Moving on to the work score, and the ROG GL502VS disappointed a little bit here with its score of under 3000. Taking a look at the results in Cinebench, and again you'll see very similar performance from the i7-7700HQ in this laptop compared to some of the other gaming laptops we've reviewed with this CPU inside. This is a pretty similar scenario that you'll see in our X264 encoding benchmark. Again, this laptop obliterates some of the ultrabooks you'll see thanks to its extra cores, and you know, it's a multi-threaded workload, so you'd expect to see very strong performance from the i7-7700HQ. Moving on to WinRAR, again, you see very similar performance from the i7-7700HQ here compared to some of the other gaming laptops we've reviewed with this CPU inside, and a very similar situation in MATLAB as well. Taking a look at our simulation workloads, which are mostly single-threaded, this laptop performs very well here thanks to its high clock speeds on the i7-7700HQ. Before we dive right into our gaming benchmarks, we will take a look at one 3D Mark workload, and we've chosen Time Spy because it is the most intensive workload that you will find. Its score of over 5000 is pretty decent for a GTX 1070 laptop. It comes in 50% faster than some of our GTX 1060 laptops and just 18% slower than our GTX 1080 laptop. So this is pretty much what you'll expect to see in the most GPU bound games that you'll find today, such as Rise of the Tomb Raider, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Moving on to games performance now, and one thing that you guys have been requesting is 1% low results for laptops, and this is definitely something I've been working on. I don't have enough data to put up comparisons just yet, but I will be stating the 1% low results for all of the games that you'll see here today, starting with Tomb Raider, an older title which pushes 80 frames per second on average, making it 46% faster than our GTX 1060 laptops, and a 1% low result of 60 FPS makes it quite smooth gaming performance overall. Moving on to Metro Last Light's very high benchmark, and we're looking at over 100 FPS average here, which is 31% faster than our GTX 1060 laptops, with a 1% low result of 50 FPS. So a bit of a low 1% low result here, but that's pretty typical for laptops that we've seen. Moving on to BioShock Infinite, and we're starting to see a small CPU bottleneck here. 126 FPS average at its maximum 1080p quality settings, 26% faster than the GTX 1060, and a 1% low result of 56 FPS. Middle-earth: Shadow of Mordor, a game that tends to perform quite well on laptops, 124 FPS average here, 40.6% faster than the GTX 1060 with a 1% low of 80 FPS, so a really strong performance here in this game. Moving on to Grand Theft Auto 5, and another strong result for the GL502VS with an average of 86 frames per second, making it 38% faster than our GTX 1060 laptops, and a 1% low of 58 FPS is very respectable here. In Batman Arkham Knight, 78 FPS average, meaning that it is 39% faster than our GTX 1060 laptops, and that 1% low rate of 43 is pushing it a little bit low in this title, but it's not too bad nonetheless considering that this is a G-Sync laptop. Rise of the Tomb Raider, the most intensive title in our benchmark suite. We're looking at a 48 FPS average in the DX12 mode, which makes it a huge 63% faster than our GTX 1060 laptops. However, the 1% low FPS count of just 21 means that we're not seeing too smooth performance here, and you will want to bring that quality setting down to about the high level, which results in a 1% low of 45 FPS in our testing, if you wanted to play this game at sort of the more smoother frame rates that you'd expect from a PC gaming experience. Deus Ex: Mankind Divided, ultra settings, average frame rate here of 57 FPS, making it 43% faster than our GTX 1060 laptops, and a very strong 1% low result here at 47 FPS. So not too far away from that average result, and again, strong performance here from the GTX 1070. We don't have too much comparison data for the following games, but you can enjoy some in-game footage here as we go through some results. In Hitman, 94 FPS average with a 1% low of 57 FPS at its 1080p ultra settings in DirectX 12, so this is a game that runs really well on the GL502VS. Civilization 6, CPU limited here, so we can't expect too much from the i7-7700HQ, but at its 1080p maximum quality settings in DirectX 12, we can still see a 53 FPS average with a 1% low of 38 FPS. Good results here in this game, and one of the most intensive titles, except for Rise of the Tomb Raider, Watch Dogs 2. At its 1080p Ultra preset, an average FPS of 51 and a 1% low of 37. So even if at its Ultra preset, you're still getting a good gaming experience in Watch Dogs 2 Ultra quality settings, and G-Sync helps out a little bit to make that experience nice and smooth. One thing you may have noticed across all of our benchmarks is we do have another GTX 1070 laptop to compare it to, and in general the GL502VS was around 2 to 7% slower. That other Asus laptop you see there has a more powerful CPU, and that can result in slightly higher frame rates on average, but a strong performance result from the GL502VS nonetheless. And just briefly, let's take a look at the SSD performance. It was disappointing to discover that it uses just a Micron 1100 SATA drive, so not a PCI NVMe SSD like we see in a number of other gaming laptops, and this leads to limited sequential performance here. Sequential read speeds of just 435 megabytes per second is quite a lot lower than some other gaming laptops that we've seen, and you'll see similar performance results in our random results. Again, performance falling a little bit below what we'd expect from other gaming laptops. Now that we've covered the performance, let's take a look at how this laptop performs from a cooling standpoint. And when I opened up the GL502VS, I was surprised to discover how small the heatsinks are, considering there's a GTX 1070 inside. It seems that Asus has opted for a fast fan design that pushes air aggressively through that small heatsink, which is attached to the GPU and CPU through some pretty massive heat pipes. Surprisingly though, this laptop isn't too loud under load. It's certainly no louder than any other gaming laptop I've used, and the fan noise profile is reasonably pleasant, meaning that there's no high-pitched jet engine whine, and if you're using, say, external speakers or, a good pair of headphones, you won't notice the fan noise too much over your in-game audio, and that's a pretty decent result from this gaming laptop. As far as thermals are concerned, in the intensive ID64 stability test with both the CPU and GPU being loaded to the max, the CPU sits at around 90 degrees Celsius and the GPU at 80 degrees Celsius with only limited CPU throttling. This represents a very, very intensive and worst case scenario for the GL502VS, and in actual games like Watch Dogs 2, the CPU sits more like 80 degrees Celsius with the GPU as well at 80 degrees Celsius with no thermal throttling in sight. So despite the fact that those heatsinks are quite small, the actual thermal performance of this laptop in games is very decent, and I don't see any reason for complaints as far as the design of the cooling solution is concerned. Perhaps the most attractive aspect of the GL502VS is its price. At $1,700 this is the cheapest current generation GTX 1070 laptop you can get, and this is mostly due to the use of a 128GB SSD compared to 256GB in competitors from MSI, Gigabyte and so forth, with those laptops costing around $100 more. So if you're on a really tight budget and you can't simply spare that extra $100, the GL502VS is the best option. And for those of you in Australia, it costs around $3,000 dues, so again, a pretty competitive price point in my local region. At this price point, you get a very decent gaming experience. I was a bit disappointed with the SSD performance, but the Core i7-7700HQ and the GTX 1070 are well suited to playing today's games at 1080p ultra settings at frame rates above 60 FPS. The display, it's a 120Hz G-Sync panel, so again, very well suited to this GTX 1070 laptop because often you'll be pushing those frame rates above 60 FPS, and that's where the 120Hz refresh rate really comes into its own. I was reasonably impressed with the cooling solution solution, despite the fact that inside it's actually a pretty tiny heatsink. And the main downside, I guess, this laptop is its design. Not too much of a fan of the plastic body that they've used here, and even though it is reasonably light at just 2.2 kilograms, in fact it's the lightest GTX 1070 laptop on the market, I just wish that the design was a little bit more premium for this price point. But that said, again, you'll be mostly concerned with the hardware in the GL502VS, and Asus has really delivered a great gaming experience on this laptop here. Anyway, that's it for my review of the GL502VS. Check out the full review on techspot.com. Links to our Patreon are below, and we will catch you in the next one.